am shocked. My husband decided to DNA test our 3 kids, only to find out they all have different fathers. Hello, Redditors, thank you for listening. My name is Queeneth, and I am, at least I was, married with 3 beautiful children who I somehow lost custody of. Well, 2 of them. I've lost custody of 2 of them, but I'll live. I want to talk about my mistake, and I sincerely hope you will listen and learn from it too. Please try not to judge me too much for what I'll confess to here. Thank you. So Darren and I had met in my final years of college, and he was attracted to me. I was attracted to him too, but I was somewhat of the shy type that knew how to hide their expressions almost very well. He had tried to flirt with me. He used the word court when he approached me again after our initial meeting, but I hadn't given him a positive answer. Darren had already graduated, I found out later, but he had been in school at the time for his certificate and some clearance to close up his school file at his faculty, and we had met. He sort of followed me around. I did not mind though, and he had been the sweetest man I had ever met in all my 4 years at college, and he was polite to his elders too, so I had sort of agreed, though denying that I had fallen for him too. I told him let's give it a try to see how far it goes, and he quickly accepted it, though I had not really been sure about it. As I said, I wanted to see how far it would go, how serious he was. Darren and I had met again after 3 years of being separated after I graduated. Darren had to travel abroad for work, and he had been transferred back to the country after 3 years of working with them. He was excited to see me since we had only been exchanging calls and texts. I personally thought that he wasn't interested anymore, so I had moved on. But after seeing how sincere he had been, how dedicated he was to getting our relationship to work again, to build back again, I decided to cut off my old partner, Gregory, if you count the 2 years we had spent together, and how I was leaving him for another man and focus on Darren properly. Darren had said he wanted to settle down with me, so why not? I would be getting a sure companion out of it. Of course, I told Darren that I would have to get over my old relationship first, like setting everything on a clean slate again first before I could give him my full 100%. Now the man I had been with before Darren returned, Gregory, was not the type to be let go. He had the mentality that he should always be the one doing the letting go, and not the other way around. Meaning that it wasn't over till he said it was, but for some reason, he had not made a move, and he had texted me saying that it was okay if I wanted to settle down with someone who was ready for me, since he himself had not been ready at the time, so I thought nothing of it, and I thanked him. That had been the beginning of a dangerous game and the turn of events that followed a few years into my marriage. I didn't know it would lead to some life-threatening experiences. The wedding was a blissful experience. I cried tears of joy, and my parents, by that I mean my father because I lost my mother when I was younger. I was so happy on that day, and he cried as well as he told Darren to handle me with care, and I tearfully told him I was a big girl and I could take care of myself. Everyone around us laughed, and we continued the wedding. After we said our vows and went through with the wedding reception, Darren and I went for our honeymoon, and I felt bliss like nothing else could compare to. I had found happiness, or so I thought. Darren had flown us out of the country for our honeymoon, which was full of lavish dinners and relaxing beaches for a whole month, and the nights had been full of passionate lovemaking. It wasn't my first time in a man's arms, but Darren made me feel like it had been my first time in bed with a man. I was so amazed at how amazing he was in bed, and I childishly wished for the honeymoon to never end, and that it should not end too soon, but I had to get back to work soon, so we had to cut our enjoyment short and return home in time so we'd start work. After our honeymoon, Darren and I returned to the country, and we moved to a quiet neighborhood with a nice little white fence around the properties. It was the neighborhood of my dreams, as weird as that sounds, with friendly people, and the house had a big yard at the back and a decent driveway for both our cars. I couldn't contain my joy. I couldn't be happier. We were together for around a year before we decided that it was time to try for a child. Darren decided that we'd wait for at least a year after the wedding before we would try to have babies, because we would need to prepare more than just a house for the children. We also needed to stabilize ourselves mentally some more before we would bring children into the world, and I had wholeheartedly agreed. I also needed time to prepare, since carrying a pregnancy to full term was going to be stressful both physically and emotionally, and a year later I got pregnant. I was 22 by then. I was so excited, and I told my father, who was eagerly waiting for his grandchild or children, if the pregnancy happened to be for twins. When Melody was born, the celebrations that followed us so much, and the level of excitement around her birth led to her name, Melody, because we were happy, and we had essentially been singing for joy. Melody was around 2 years old or so when I started to get strange spam calls and text messages. I mean calls and texts from unknown or foreign numbers, and the messages had usually been cryptic, one word or one sentence in total, so it irritated me initially, much like the spam calls that would get disconnected as soon as I answered, and the number would become unreachable when I would try to call them back. One of the spam texts had simply read Queeneth, and I had been puzzled, but I had considered it to be scams of some sort and let it be. The messages were becoming confusing, saying things like, "They'll find me and they miss me," whoever it was, and somehow my mind provided me with an imposing, arousing image of Gregory, and after so many years since our relationship ended. I shivered because I had a feeling like a mix between shame for thinking like that and arousal because the view in my head was mouth-watering. But I shook it all off as I had remembered that the last I heard of Gregory, he had left the country. He was a CEO of some company. There was no way I could get a taste no matter how attractively my mind painted him. There was also definitely no way he could be the one doing anything. I changed all my contact details, social security number changed and updated, after many tedious months and processes, after my marriage to properly sever mine and Gregory's relationship permanently. For good. Yet I felt like I was telling myself lies. I had no idea why, but I felt a shiver of excitement run down my spine at the thought of being chased again, being obsessed over and stalked. Call me a glutton for punishment, but it had felt quite exciting. After the strange texts and calls had come the mails, like actual letters in the mailbox. I was even more puzzled by this. I tried to trace the sender, but even the company could do nothing to track the sender and addresses. Actually, there were no addresses. Like a ghost was responsible for slipping a letter in my house mailbox. Either that or the person had put the letter there by themselves. I'd started to enjoy the game of hide and seek, though I would definitely deny it if I was asked. I received an anonymous mail saying, "I'll come for you soon." One Wednesday evening, along with a small bottle of very expensive perfume, a few years after I had birthed my first child, my daughter Melody. She was 4 years old then. There had been no sender or address of any kind on the envelope again, after such a long time without those scary emails. I checked the mailbox over and over again to find a clue or anything like that, but the ecstatic shock running up my spine was obvious, and I was getting more curious. I remember that I went out with friends, a bridal shower. I think, well, the clothes in my suitcase had given that away, but I had left earlier and the rest of my memory was a blur, bored out of my mind and irritated until I bumped into a familiar face. Gregory was back in the country and he looked as delectable as ever, as always. We talked over drinks, heading over to a bar near the hotel Gregory was staying for the duration of his return, and we somehow caught up on how each other's lives had been going all this while. I had a faint feeling that it was Gregory that was sending those letters. He liked to play games like that, liked the intrigue that somehow got me going more than usual. Gregory eyed the ring on my finger, making a comment about the stone in the middle of the silver ring, claiming that he could have done better, and I giggled like a teenager, and he responded with that predatory smirk of his. I told him that I had ended things with him because he was not ready to commit to a lifelong relationship, and his expression changed slightly from my words. Yeah, he claimed once again, like he had when we were dating all those years ago, that he was never ready to let me go. I asked him if it would still be the same now that I was married with a child, and he laughed at me. Gregory told me that I was special and would remain special in his eyes no matter what, for a very long time. I told him that no one really got me the way he did, and his expression changed again, but this time, he smiled and reached for my hand on the bar. He made a motion to move upstairs, and I smiled warmly at him, nodding. I stood up and followed him out of the bar to the hotel. I had driven my car to the hotel parking lot while he went up and got room service, and I waited for him. When we got to the room, Gregory had commented that he could smell his gift on me and complimented me, saying that it suited me. Things went so fast, and just like that, I slept with him. It had been a fantastic night, and I had never been held that intensely for years. I hated to admit that Gregory was the only man who could take care of me so well in bed, knew how to touch me right and make me feel like I was in cloud nine almost all night to leave me a breathless, painting mess. By the time it was morning, Gregory had ordered room service and we had breakfast in bed, showered together, and went through another steamy round that left the glass foggy, and I was carried back to the room. We somehow rekindled our relationship again. We had agreed to meet again and talk over a nice meal, and I went home happy and excited, but I had gone home to an empty house. My husband was on a trip with my children to my dad, so I texted Gregory. We texted almost all day, and did I find myself falling? Yes, I was falling after a night of passion and a bit of obsessive chasing and flirting. I had been secretly going out with Gregory. We were meeting at almost every month end and on some weekends for dates that most often ended in passionate nights and left me with jello for legs. Gregory spoiled me with gifts, exotic things. There was also the sort of attention and service that I had never experienced with or gotten from Darren, so I continued the relationship and everything was smooth sailing and rosy, till I had somehow become careless. A bit careless. So what led to your husband deciding on a paternity test, you might have wondered? My husband would never think like that. Never have such an idea, because after all, I was the perfect partner, the perfect wife. He must have seen a letter that hinted at a paternity test. That must have been it. I thought back to the turn of events. I had been receiving strange letters in the mail for almost 3 months after Adam, my third child, was born, and each letter roughly had the same near-vague message. One of them had simply said something about a son, and I quickly discarded it, burning it up in the backyard grill stand, and I had made my husband worried, but I told him to think nothing of it. I was certain that it was not Gregory this time. It had to be someone else, because Gregory had no reason to write such letters since we now had something again. Something quite nice. I was fairly certain that my husband had been the recipient of one of the strange letters that had been slowly eating away at my mentality and filling me with anxiety. It had to be. And something just had to confirm this. Now my husband watched me panic almost every day at the sight of strange letters, and he watched me set them ablaze with a frightened look on my face each time, shaking hands and with a face as pale as a ghost's when I would come back in. He began to notice how shaky I was as of late, and it had made him suspicious to the point where he had begun to intercept my letters. Later I figured, someone has definitely been monitoring me. I came back from work one faithful day when I saw him through our bedroom window walking towards the grill and setting pieces of paper ablaze. Some very familiar pieces of papers. You see, the sender of the letters, my new dreadful stalker, had always used one particular type of paper to always write the letters sent, and I had memorized it at that point. My heart skipped a beat when I saw them in my husband's hands. Darren had seen them before I could get them, and since it was more than one letter, it was obvious that Darren had taken a few from the mail before I could get to them. I sighed, coming to the realization that it was not just a break in the sending of the letters, but rather a change in the recipient, a change in who opened the mailbox first. Now, some of the letters were still as cryptic as usual, but some tended to be quite specific or descriptive. One time I received a letter with my second son's day, month, year, and time of birth, and the date of conception, which clashed with what my memory provided me with and made my son's, Stephen's, date of birth make some sense. It made too much sense and had bluntly pointed to my newly kindled affair with Gregory. Someone had a hand in something they should not. My husband and I began to sort of drift apart after the letters, and I tried to play it off, play dumb and act oblivious to it. I hoped that if I acted normal, my husband would let it go and drop whatever it was that was keeping him on edge, but it only worked for so long before he started to get restless and started to look for clues and answers. And no, my husband was not following me around or anything like that. My husband had taken a more clinical approach to everything. My husband went to the ministry to check my former social security number before I had changed my name and sort of adjusted my identity cards. He had found a way to access my previous social media accounts, and he thoroughly investigated my past to track the strange letters properly. Something I had been too terrified to do because I did not want the details of my relationship with my former lover to be in the open. I was told later on that Gregory and Darren met and spoke about me and about my past relationship with Gregory, but when Darren returned home, he had a blank look on his face, and he did not speak to me at all that night and almost all through the next day. We finally spoke to each other after almost 48 hours of silence and thick tension. Well, not really speaking. Darren came to me with questions. Darren asked me if I broke off my relationship with Gregory properly. He confronted me barely an hour after we had tucked the children in for the night. I was taken aback. I blinked rapidly as I took in his question, and my previous encounter with Gregory after I had Melody flashed right before my eyes. I didn't notice quickly that I was shaking, but Darren had, and he had let out a sigh. Fear washed over me at the thought of my husband catching on to my secret, but I tried to play it cool. Darren clarified that he had no intention of scaring me, and I struggled to get my breath under control, formulating my excuses and lies. I told Darren that he had said he would let me go so I could get married. I breathed out and I watched a frown form onto Darren's face. The gears in his head had been turning. Darren said that as long as the relationship with Gregory ended, then he was all right with it. His expression had still not changed despite the change in tone, not angry anymore, but tired and hurt now. Darren asked if I had slept with him again after we got married. My heart sank, but I shook my head a bit before answering. Something didn't feel right. I stuttered, getting tongue-tied, and Darren's face hardened even more at my words. I tried again, bluntly lied to his face that I had not, and Darren just raised a brow. He went on to ask about the letters, the ones about a child. I told him that I didn't understand them myself. More lies. I confessed to being more terrified than curious, and Darren had nodded at this. He had his arms crossed over his chest as he asked if I was sure that I wasn't cheating on him, and I looked him in the face this time as I answered. I had contacted Gregory previously, who had told me to calm down and assured me that he would do something to ensure that we would not get caught. I answered, lied to Darren's face that I had not, and silently prayed for it to end there, for the entire matter to die down, but my prayers had not been answered. He spoke so calmly and said we should do a DNA test. He said it was the only way to prove my innocence. I was scared, but I assumed he'll forget about it soon, so I just told him that we could do it, so he'd stop doubting me. There was a heavy weight on my chest, especially at the thought of something that I hadn't told my husband about for some time yet, and I had not yet worked up the nerve to reveal to him yet. I considered spilling the beans, but I thought better of it, opting for something else. I tried to act soothing and calming, telling him that we were tired and that it would be better to rest and talk about it at a later date, and it seemed to be working as his shoulders had relaxed and he breathed in and out gently before he had come close to hold my hand and led me to the bed. He held me through the night, and when morning came, we went about our days and businesses as usual. I lied. I had wanted him to forget about it, forget about everything, while I had tried to call Gregory again, even after he had promised to help me not get caught. On the D-Day, my husband came to pick me up from the office as I had gone to work without my car, and he came with the children. I was so confident, ready to go along with his request because I was so convinced that all of the children had been with Darren, except Adam, that is. But I did not want to think about it that way. I planned to find my way out of everything after the test confirmed that 2 of the children were Darren's. Even my first few times with Gregory would not be able to influence the DNA test results in any way, since we had played safe despite not using protection frequently for a while, or so I thought. I was convinced and I was cautious. The only time we really played without protection, and I had gotten protection, was because we mutually agreed to sort of have a child and seal the deal properly before we broke things off. Darren gave me a look as I slid into the passenger seat, a very disgusted look that I returned with an equivalent of my own look of disgust towards him, and the kids looked at us questioningly. My youngest, Adam, had spoken up, and his older siblings turned their attention towards us as well, since I and Darren were not talking. I smiled and reached back to ruffle his curly hair and tell him that it was fine. I assured him, and all 3 of them had relaxed at my words, relaxing in their seats as my husband pulled out of the driveway and we began our trip to the local hospital. We arrived and we were directed to the doctor's office, from which we headed to the laboratory where blood was drawn from Darren and the children, and then we were taken back to the laboratory waiting room to wait for the test results. The first test results showed that only 1 child had a 91% match rate with the DNA of my husband, so we will have to run the tests again. The doctor was reading through the slips of papers that had come out from the laboratory, and the look my husband gave me was nothing short of a chilling glare that made me scared. I was scared and confused by this. I was pretty sure I had conceived at least 2 children with Darren, and there was no way the paternity test would have had such results unless that wasn't so. It had to be a mistake. I consoled myself as I sat there with my husband and children and waited for them to run the second test. The second test had slightly different results this time. This time, there had been a 97% match in genetic material of the father, Darren, and one of the children. The doctor had the decency to look at me apologetically, and my husband frowned harder. I asked the doctor to run the tests again. I did not believe in the results. I was barely able to hide the panic in my voice as I spoke to the doctor, and I looked pleadingly at my husband, who had only let out a tired sigh and nodded his assent, and the doctor went back to the lab again to run a third test, and I prayed silently to every deity that existed on the face of the earth that the second result had just been some sort of glitch, but I was sorely disappointed by the next slip that had been handed over to us. It was another 97% of a match with my husband's DNA, but for only one of the children. With that third test, the verdict had been finalized and read. One of the children, only our first daughter, had been his, and the other 2 belonged to another man or other men, and I had to explain it to him. And fast, too, before I lost a tooth or ended up with a broken rib or broken something. I cursed under my breath as the car ride back home was silent. Gregory wasn't with me, and I had to deal with this myself. Gregory had disappointed me, and now I had to face the music. Darren looked menacing as he crowded me in a corner of our bedroom. His voice had been deathly calm as he spoke to me. He told me to confess, and there was cold sweat running down my spine. It was clear that I was scared. I apologized and told him in tears to back away a bit. Told him I was beginning to panic and start hyperventilating, but he only looked at me, telling me to confess or choose to either faint from my panic attack. I cried and wailed. I was glad that our room was sort of soundproof because I knew that the kids would not have heard even if they were home at that moment. They were at my in-laws' place, that was closer, since Darren said we had to talk. It was from the time we left the hospital that he took a turn and took us to his parents' house. My mother-in-law was ecstatic to see us, but we told her that we had not come to make our usual periodic visits. Darren lied to his mother, saying that he and I had clashing business trips outside of town, so we had come to drop off the children for the night. Since we usually went to their place for visits, the children already had few clothes there. My mother-in-law had said that the children could stay even long after we both got back from our trips, so we could have some romantic nights without restraints when we got back. I felt so guilty then. So going back to when we were in the room, I was terrified, had stumbled over my words as I began to narrate how I had been monitored after I birthed our first child, and I had woken up in a hotel right before we conceived our second child. I broke down and confessed. I admitted to having sex with my former lover, Gregory, but I quickly added that I didn't know that it was a fertile day, so it was a slim chance. I further explained that I had gone to a hotel room again after I went to visit my father one time, and it was to see my ex who had just returned to the country and had been the one responsible for the first strange letters. He had asked me to come and see him. I have the excuse that I had somehow fallen into bed with him again, and Darren looked disgusted. I saw the look on his face as I blurted out that I did not know what had possessed me to start up an affair with the man and that I was sorry. Darren had called me a heartless, cheating woman, and he yelled that I should have at least gone for a medical checkup after all of that, or that I should have just gotten rid of the child initially. He was shouting, and I found myself shrinking back in fear. He revealed that he suspected that Adam was not his, given the time frame of the boy's birth, that Darren had somehow calculated himself, and that someone had tipped me off about my movements through the time frames of my 2 last pregnancies, and tracking my phone had further confirmed it. I blinked at this and I was shocked. I kept confessing to sleeping with Gregory and apologizing. Darren yelled again, asking how long, and I flinched and let out a pained sound, a whimper, and shut my eyes tightly. I confessed to having started an affair with Gregory the year Stephen had been born. A whopping 10 years of playing hide-and-seek with a man I had sworn was now a forgotten chapter of my life. It had hit Darren differently, hurt him differently. Darren was speechless before his hand had come sailing through the air and cracked right on my cheek. The impact caused me to injure the inside of my mouth, and I started to bleed in my mouth. My eyes were wide open, and then I just stood there dazed because Darren had never hit me before. I was on my knees now, begging and apologizing. I don't know when I closed my eyes and drifted with my face swollen with tears. I woke up in mine and Darren's shared bedroom, all tucked in under the soft covers rather than the duvet, and the air conditioning was blasting cold air from a corner in the room. There was a tiny bandage on the corner of my mouth. I turned to look around and spotted 2 ibuprofen pills in a saucer on the bedside table with a glass of chilled water. My heart skipped a bit at the actions that were undoubtedly taken by my husband, and cold dread had washed over me as I remembered the metaphor of the calm before the storm. My heart sank further when I found the document right beside me on the bed, on the other pillow. My hands began to shake as I imagined the worst. I was ready for it, but it didn't change the way my gut clenched and twisted as I pulled out the contents of the brown envelope. Darren had already signed his part of the document, and all that was left were my signature and our respective thumbprints, which will be done in court. The document stated that Darren would have custody of our first daughter, while I'd keep the 2 boys and some of Darren's assets and money to help me. I felt like he only added the last statement out of pity, and I didn't deserve it. But when my mind went to raising 2 kids alone, I had decided to suck it up and keep my mouth shut. I quickly signed, although I wished I could just rip the papers apart and set myself in the house ablaze, so I could let go and be free from the guilt and shame in my mind and soul. Darren appeared at the door, asked me if I had signed the papers, as I was thinking of tearing up the papers. He had a hardened expression on his face as he looked down his nose at my pitiful self on the bed, and he let out a tired sigh as he extended his hands towards me. He asked for the papers, and I handed over the papers and the envelope over to him. Darren took a seat at the foot of the bed and told me that he didn't hate me. He asked if I knew that. Then he had gone further to say that he could not bear the fact that I had lied to him and had hidden the truth from him, and had also had children with other men. He stated once again that he knew Adam was not his, and that he had been waiting for me to confess, but I had only become depressed and sad, so he had let it be, but now it was not just one child that wasn't his. Darren said that he wanted me out of the house and that I could go get my sons from his parents. He also said we would see each other in court. He said this with finality and turned to leave, slamming the door shut behind him, and I cried out. I decided not to stay in the house anymore. I left 3 days after signing the divorce papers and headed back to my dad's house. My father hadn't asked me questions, but he was able to tell from my expressions that something was terribly wrong. I kept everything from my father until it was time to go to court and dissolve the marriage properly. I had to tell him eventually. It didn't even make anything easier, delaying like that. I had been a sobbing mess afterwards, and at dawn, it had been time to face my husband again, for the last time, our last day as husband and wife. Update. So I lost custody, which was expectedly since it was a case like mine. I was granted custody of just one child, the one that didn't belong to Darren, and the other two who happened to share genetic similarities with Darren were with him. I regret my actions, but it's not like I can change them, so I have to live with them. I cried bitterly when my youngest child and middle child, Adam and Stephen respectively, asked why they couldn't be with their siblings anymore, and I had no idea what to tell the innocent boys. I couldn't tell them that Darren was not their father and that Melody wasn't their biological sibling. God forbid that, so I played it off by promising them that they could still visit, which by law was allowed. But I promised Darren that he would never have to set his eyes on Adam and Stephen in his house again, since Adam and Stephen weren't his real sons. I still think about Darren hitting my face. He never apologized for it, and I didn't expect him to. It might not have been so bad if I hadn't tried so desperately to hide it from my husband rather than just telling him that someone had been targeting me. I regret it, deeply. But I can't really go back to the past and change anything. I also never found out who sent those other letters about Adam. It might have been Gregory or maybe my husband, and he was just pretending, but I guess I'll never know. Not that it matters now. Gregory and I called it quits eventually. Well, I called it quits, and somehow, he had been in a hurry to end things. Like he had eaten his fill of me and I was no longer useful to him. Though he agreed to shoulder some responsibility for the children, but it would be anonymous. He threatened me to make sure I never contacted him again. I don't know how a person can just change like that. So I lost even the man I had expected to stay with me after everything. If I could go back in time, I'd have never gone out with Gregory in the first place, but I can't really change the past, now can I? I only hope that anyone reading this will learn from me to be honest and to be careful too.